This is kind of a unique Zoom for us, as you know, because we're having presenters for a change. So it's going to be a little bit more structured than our typical ACWR Zooms have been in the past. First off, I want to thank Sister Eleanor Craig from the Sisters of Loretto Heritage Center and Kathy Hertel-Baker from the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth Archives, both from Kentucky, who actually both raised this issue just about a couple of months ago as a great topic to discuss through Zoom. So I'm really excited that they raised it and were willing to share with us today. So we've just attempted the share screen and it was successful. So hopefully we'll be as successful on the second try here. So I'm going to turn it over to Sister Eleanor.
Okay, so now everybody sees my screen, I hope. Yes? Oh, good, good. And now I'll get your faces out of my way. Excuse me. All right, so this is a little PowerPoint, part of which, that it is part of a presentation I made for our leadership about, well, it says 9/19. So, and I did it because since the Black Lives Matter has caught our communities and energies, there's been a lot of discussion at different levels in our community and different committees and departments have started their own work on questions about Loretto and slaveholding. We've known for a long time that our community held slaves in the pre-Civil War era, but now there's a concern. So there are a lot of people who are working on the question of what that means. There are a number of people who are deeply concerned with the question of white superiority, white supremacy, an unwelcoming white environment and culture. And so this is just, what I'm showing is just the Heritage Center's share of a much bigger conversation. And as I see it, our share is to research what we have in a year's worth of files and make it available to the community and then more widely. So that's why I made this conversation for our leadership, so they could join us in making some choices about what to do with what we know. Okay, now let's see, there. So we have to start with what we know. And because Loretto began on the Kentucky front, roots in Europe, we have no connections with any community prior to our own because we are sui generis, as they say. So what we know is from a little log cabin compound in the heart of Kentucky in 1812. So there's no, there are a few written records because fires took a lot of the early records. There's few, there aren't any photographs. There's very little oral history because, frankly, we've been busy about the work we're doing, and keeping track of it was the last thing that we had in mind. So we did begin in this little log cabin structure like that. Now let me, shoot. Now it's not going forward. Oh. Okay, and then the other way we know things is the records written down. The earliest recorded kind of thoughtful presentation of ourselves was by Bishop Spalding in the 1840s. He was a Kentuckian. His family and our community are all bound up together. So he wrote about the bigger picture of the organized institutional Catholic Church emerging on the Kentucky frontier. And we get a little line in his story. And then there are others who wrote in the 1880s. Bishop Mays, who was from Detroit, how he found us, I don't know. A newspaper reporter named Webb, he wrote about the institutional church, and so we get a paragraph there in Webb's. And then we did commission a book to be written by about us, Centennial, But like the earlier books, this book too, which was more focused on Loretto, had the very same tone. It was triumphalistic, it was self-congratulatory, it viewed all of the people in the story as saints, and that it was not self-critical, or nor did it position the story in a larger context. It also didn't mention slavery. And then in the 1900s, a number of little pieces were written, little pamphlets, even a comic book. But the trouble with the ones in the 1900s was that they all drew on those earlier secondary sources. So nobody was doing original research. There might be a little tad that was found, but mostly it was just the same old story. So self-congratulatory, uncritical, not very contextualized, and none of it mentioned slavery. This picture, which is an etching from the 1816, at first glance appears to be fantastical. It pictures the Loretto log cabin compound with religious imagery in the middle, which was not physically real. It was simply a devotional picture of the suffering Jesus and the sorrowful Mary, with the sisters under the cloak of Mary. For a long time, in fact, as far as I know, for forever, we regarded this picture as another little piece of hagiography, ourselves viewing ourselves as enclave of holiness in the middle of the wilderness. And we laughed at the stuff that surrounds it that's so fantastic. The palm trees in the foreground, big mountains in the background. But then we got another take on this from a historian at the, I can never say the name of the museum. It's in Salem, and he said, no, this is not fantastical at all. This is allegorical, and it's meant to portray the difficulty of getting to the Kentucky frontier from the East Coast. So the mountains, and there's a large riverway in the background that's not easily seen unless you can hold the picture up close to you. And it is not only remote, but it is out of our ken. It's not something we know, and that's the reason for the fantastic palm trees and whatnot. The etching came with a, it was made with a little index about what building was what, and I have superimposed the lettering on top of the little buildings and the list at the bottom. Okay, so that we have every reason to believe that this is real, in the sense that a person doing the etching was being directed by the priest who helped start our community, and so he is telling the artist where things are and what they are, even as the picture's being made. Okay, so if we wanted to have a photograph, this is the closest we could get. Okay. And our biggest concern is to look at this environment and to say, well, who lived there really? It never occurred to me in my first 50 years as a sister of Loretto to ask who was there, because I thought we knew the sisters, their students, and the priest. I mean, why would you even ask? Well, it turns out that there are a lot more people there, and I'm going to tell you who, starting with the person who lives in the house that's in the red box in front of you. That box on the labeled version of this etching is called the servant's house and the meat house. So the servant lives with the meat. The servant also lives right next to the back fence, which fences off the fields, the cultivated fields, which makes sense. That's where the servant's going to work. So who is the servant? Well, this isn't a photo a picture, drawing or of a real person in the past. This is a real person in the present whose image was used in an installation in Lexington, Kentucky recently to evoke the ancestral spirits of the enslaved persons of Kentucky. So I adopted this image to stand for the person Tom, no doubt occupied that little house in the Red Square. Tom came from Maryland with one of our founding members as her possession, at least in her mind. She had inherited Tom at the time that her father died, and on her father's will, it's listed that Anne will receive Tom. So when Anne joined the community, one of the first 6, she brought Tom with her. And almost immediately, she sold Tom for $200. And the person she sold Tom to was Charles Nerinx, the priest, who was helping the 6 people make a community. The cash from the sale of Tom was used to buy the first property, the very property where the little log cabin community was. And this is the bill of sale for Tom. So we can believe that Tom stayed in the community since Charles Nerinx, the priest, made his home in that community. He wasn't there very often, but you can assume that Tom was there. So that means that now in the little log cabin compound, there are the sisters, the students, the priest, and Tom. So then the question is, who else might have been there? Because that there's one, then you have to say, well, there might be more. So the rule, our very first handwritten rule, which was made up by Charles Nerinx and the women, it is not something that was brought from Europe. It isn't the rule of St. Vincent or St. Augustine, although later the Augustine template was imposed on it. But this is just what Nerinx and the women made up themselves. And in is a specification in the appendix. That's how this page. People who are not the sisters. So the first set of them are called associates. They have no active or passive voice. They may be dismissed for good reason. They come behind the professed, but before the novices, and they have different rules. Oh, excuse me, and they have the same rules as the society. These are like co-members or like associates. Well, who were they? They were women in their elder years who have a welcome in the homes of their families. They were younger women who were sort of in between. They weren't any longer living in their families' homes, but they weren't married. Also, might have been Black. Then there are the oblates. The oblates, this is really interesting. You can't read that writing very well unless you're right on top of it, but it says, oblates are those that offer themselves or are offered to spend their lives or part of it about the society. What is this or are offered? Well, in another place, Charles Nerinx writes, it's his ambition that the little log cabin community, the people inside the fence, will include ailing or decrepit or cast-off slaves who are given refuge by the community. They are still claimed by somebody, but they're not living with the somebody who claims them. They're living with Loretto. And these, the writing goes on to say, they live in a separate house, follow the rule with modifications, undergo a novitiate, and persons of all ages may be admitted and of any condition. That's where I think, again, we get a clue that some of these are enslaved persons. So now, this is another of the images from the Ancestor Spirit installation in Lexington. Now we can think about ourselves as including not only the sisters, but other women, older and younger, women of color, women without choices, not by their own choice. And when the sisters were forced to move from the little log cabin compound to the place that we call our mother house now, they built a building like this. Look how large it is. This is the actual construction design from 1824. And before they got to 1834, they'd built this grand building to be an academy, quite different from a reading, writing, and arithmetic country school. And in both these buildings, the thing is that there has to be somebody doing the work. Just like there had to be somebody doing the work for the little log cabin compound. I had always taken for granted that when we talked about Loretto women were women of the frontier, it meant that we did our own work. And since we began this conversation about our slaves, I have had to face the fact that we did not do our own work. We owned people who did our work. Now, to what extent, we have no clear idea. But we're going to get a little clue of it in a minute. First, though, I want to say, when Loretto left, sent people beyond Kentucky, we sent them to slave states, to Missouri, and then to Arkansas, and then to Kansas when it was still a territory and still uncertain about whether it would welcome slaves, and then to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the Indians enslaved one another's and the Spaniards enslaved Indians, and so we were a Southern community. We stayed in the southern part even when we went to the West, and we took our slaves with us. This is a picture of 3 of our sisters who, 2 of them are founding members of our work in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And those 2 women were women who came from the original Kentucky families. They knew slavery well. And so there's a question here. The woman on the left adopted the young man who's sitting in front of her. He was a Taos Pueblo Indian. So what did adopted mean? In the Southwest, at the time our sisters got there in the 1850s, it was commonplace for Anglos and Hispanics to, quote, adopt Indian children, when what was really going on was that they were enslaved. The word adopted was purely a euphemism. Now, it's possible that this was not an enslavement situation because the young man, I have his name, but without my crib notes, I can't tell you. The young man lived part-time in the Pueblo and part-time worked for the sisters. I'm hoping that that means he was not enslaved, but I don't know for sure. Okay, so there are these questions. And oh shoot, Susanna, get your own version of the chart because I don't have it on this version of the PowerPoint. And I'll finish talking, and then Kathy, it'll be just a couple more minutes. Okay, so in 2000, the year 2000, when we were celebrating the bicentennial, and Loretto was getting ready to celebrate its own 200th anniversary, we went together with the charities at Nazareth and the Dominicans in Springfield. And all 3 of our communities reflected a bit on our part in slaveholding in the South, the Upper South. And this memorial is in the Loretto Cemetery, but it is not unlike memorials that are at Nazareth and at the Dominicans in Springfield. And it lists the names, the individual names of as many people as we could find in our records. But the making of this list predates the widespread use of the internet. And so there are errors on this list that need to be rectified and more names added. And then this is a picture, the image at the top. Come on. Well, maybe I'm not going to show you the image at the top. Ah, there we go. There. Okay, are you ready, Susanna?
Yeah.
I'll stop screen sharing and you screen share. This is Susanna Pyatt, the curator at the Loretto Heritage Center. And she just wrote a blog about how many slaves there might have been.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to share my screen.
Good.
There we go.
Uh-huh.
So our records for, especially before the Civil War at Loretto, are pretty spotty. The convent burned in 1858, so that might have taken care of a lot of them, unfortunately. So when we try to look in the records for records of enslaved people, sometimes we'll find mentions here and there, but nothing that gives a really complete picture at all. So in the past couple of weeks, I started looking at census data for every 10 years, starting in 1820, and going up through 1880 was as far as I looked. So there's still limitations to the census data. It does not list individuals by name at all until 1850, and there are separate censuses for enslaved individuals in 1850 and 1860, and they list individuals, but they don't give their names. It's just their age and gender and whether they are Black or mixed race. But I was able to pull the data for all of, or most of Loretto's houses before the Civil War in Kentucky and Missouri, and at least get a picture of how many enslaved individuals they had in those little 10-year snapshots. And also an age breakdown roughly with age ranges and gender. So from that, we can see that, you know, starting in 1820, there's a number of enslaved people at the Mother House. They're at most of the schools that open in Kentucky and Missouri before the Civil War. It looks like there's the most enslaved people in 1850. There's a lot of institutions that don't seem to have slaves in 1860. That could be because I was just looking under the wrong name, because it can be tricky to find the convent listings. But you can tell that there's both men and women who are enslaved, and it doesn't seem to be weighted one way or the other. There's a lot of children who are present, including in 1850. There's 2 infants at the Mother House who are enslaved. And let's see, by after the war, we don't see very many people of color who are living in the same households. There will be like maybe 2 teenage girls who are listed as house servants, but the switch seems to be from enslaved labor to hired white male labor after the Civil War, at least in terms of who is living in the household, because that's what the census shows.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much. So we're thinking and we're investigating and we're trying to make a plan about how to get more good research done in our archives. And that's sort of where we are in this long process, which we've hardly defined yet, but we've started off on it anyway. Kathy, it's your turn.
Thanks, Sister Eleanor. Hi, I'm Kathy. I'm with the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth in Nazareth, Kentucky. We're about 20 minutes up the road from Sister Eleanor in the Kentucky Holy Land. And the Sisters of Charity, we were founded about 6 months after the Sisters of Loretto in December of 1812. And I'm just going to tell a little bit about our history, tell you some of the history of the enslaved persons who were at Nazareth, and talk more about the records that we have, because we're in a slightly different situation than the Sisters of Loretto, in that we've had a sister do very extensive research into our records, and she has gone through our materials and tracked down every reference of enslaved people that we've been able to find in all of our records, and has compiled all of those into a set of resources for us. So I'm going to show you some examples of those resources and talk about some of the exhibits and things that we've done with those materials. So let me go ahead. And we had some internet problems at my office today, so I wasn't able to download my actual PowerPoint, so I had to throw this one together this morning, so it's not quite as refined as Sister Eleanor's today. But, so let's see if that'll, there we go. So the records that we have of those who were enslaved at Nazareth, the first mentions we have are with the original women who started the congregation. There were the first six. Just I find it interesting that with the Loretto sisters, it was also 6 women initially who formed the community. And for us, once 6 women came, they were allowed to formally create their community and take their vows and become the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. But those early women, at least one of them brought an enslaved person with her as part of what they would call almost their dowry. And so it was not uncommon from the very beginning for the sisters, for the women who came to join the community, to bring an enslaved person with them from their family as part of their contribution to the community. And these people would be, they would work initially at what was called Nazareth, which was at Old St. Thomas, about 6 miles from the current location of the community, where Bishops Flagey and David had their first church in the Bardstown diocese. And they helped build the buildings on that site. And then in 1822, when the sisters were forced to move to a new site, they brought their enslaved people with them, who helped make the new site suitable for the sisters and the rest of the community to move out there. And I'll talk more about, I have a larger version of this picture, which I will talk about in a few more slides. So here, these are some drawings that a sister did of the 1822 site, a couple years after the sisters finally settled there. This is the site that we're still on today. So in 2022, we'll be celebrating 200 years at this site. And what's interesting, and the verbiage used at the time is obviously not politically correct, but you'll see here, they termed it the darkies cabin, but that was where the enslaved people had their cabins on the campus at this time, the 1820s, through to the 1860s. And then in another scrapbook that we have of drawings, this was labeled as the recreation hall. And this was for the enslaved people who were living on the campus at the time to, this is where they would have sometimes their meals and could have time to themselves. And so types of materials that we have documenting enslaved people at Nazareth, when Sister Teresa Knebel, who did all of this research, when she originally started looking into this, the beliefs of the sisters had been that there had been enslaved people, but they had all come in with sisters, and that there had been no buying and selling of human beings. But as they looked into the records more, they found that that was not the case. And it wasn't just the priests who had been involved with this, but the sisters were involved with this also. The priests had to be involved because legally the sisters couldn't do a lot of this themselves, especially prior to 1829 when they incorporated their Nazareth Literary and Benevolent Institution, which was their business arm, which is still in operation today. So you'll see on the left, this is the bill of sale for George and his wife, Mary. Mary had been living on a different farm, and they requested that that farmer sell Mary at the same time so that they could go to the same place when they sold George, so that the family could stay together. And this is Father Hazeltine's signature here. You'll see that a lot, that they tried to keep family units together. They tried to, it's so weird to use the phrase sell people, but I mean, that's, they tried to sell their enslaved people to other Catholic families, but it doesn't change the fact that that's exactly what they were doing, was selling human beings to other people. This is a writ of manumission where they freed an enslaved person named Luke, as he had been with them for a certain period of time, and they had an agreement where he would be freed. And you can see this is also signed by Father Hazeltine and Mother Catherine. And we found several examples of bills of sales, agreements for purchasing. We found the name of a known slave broker in some of our records, so we know that the board of the Nazareth Literary and Benevolent Institution was working with a Bardstown broker to manage the buying and selling. It didn't happen often, but when it did happen, they seemed to more often go through a broker than personally contacting another family or another group to arrange these things. But they were very close with the people that were enslaved. There were at one point as many as 45 persons owned by the community or enslaved by the community, but the letters, they never use the word slave. It's always servant or family. They seem to very conscientiously avoid that word in all of their letters. And you see there's dozens of letters where the sisters are writing to each other, and they mention the whole family, including Mary and George and little Sue, and asking how these different folks are doing and what's going on, which, I mean, it shows a real care, but also it puts you off a little bit to see how they can see folks as family, but also know at the same time that they were considered property at the same time. And it's something that's that the community, is working on dealing with and accepting that this is part of the history. In our annals, the enslaved people are mentioned. This is from January 1st of 1865, which in Kentucky was the official day of emancipation. And so the sisters brought those enslaved there together. They had dinner. They gave them some food and supplies. Any who wished to stay were offered housing and a job on the property. Any who wished to leave were given a few days' supply to go wherever they wanted to go. Several men went off and joined the Army. Prior to emancipation, 6 or 7 actually ran off with the Union troops. We also have marriage records because they encouraged those enslaved to receive the sacraments, to convert to Catholicism, and to receive the sacraments, baptism, Eucharist, confirmation, marriage. So they had them, if they chose to be married, they could be married in the church. And so the letter, you'll see in the sisters' letters, they talk about preparing for weddings and baptisms, and then they would have a party afterwards. They bake a plum cake and have a get-together. And then when we did some digging in some of our county records after going through the records in our archives, we were able to find some of the official marriage records that came afterwards when African Americans were allowed to legally get married in Kentucky. So this is Henry and Emily, who had been married about 20 years prior in the church at Nazareth, getting their marriage made legal in the state of Kentucky with their marriage certificate here. And then in our baptism and confirmation books, you'll see the baptismal records for the children who were born enslaved at Nazareth. This is Isidore, who was the son of Mary and Harry Bean. He was born in 1845. And one of the things we were able to do with the records that we have is we were able to create family lists and family units because the families, for the most part, stayed on campus. So we were able to trace parents and children on campus and marriages, and then follow some of the children who were either emancipated or escaped and went off to the Army or were sold to other farms because we had something akin to a first name and a last name, or a birthplace or a birth date. So it's helped with some of the genealogical records, also having death dates for those who are buried in our cemetery. And then we've also tracked down materials from other collections. This particular item, we do not have the original in our collection, but we were able to get a copy of it. And we do have in our letters a mention of the man, Red, who had escaped, and we believe he must have been recaptured because the mentions we have of him are that he was back on campus and doing well and back working in the kitchen. And they post-date the date of this announcement. So the sisters kept in contact with the persons who had been enslaved on campus, and as part of the centennial, invited everyone that they could track down, because a lot of descendants were still either working on campus or had settled in the Bardstown area. So they sent out invitations to a special day for the 1912 centennial. They called it the Servants Reunion, and they had over 200 people come back for the reunion on campus, and they served the sisters served a chicken dinner, and the students at the academy put on their centennial play that they were doing. For the centennial, they had about 2 weeks worth of programs, and each day was dedicated. There's a day for the priests and clergy, and a day for parents of students, and a day for alum. And so they would have a similar program each day. And as part of the program on the Servants Reunion Day, they took this photograph of the people who had returned for it. It's very interesting because I ended up taking it on the porch of the new laundry building that had been finished in 1900, rather than on the steps of the Mother House or the Academy building, which I think is very telling. But it's so amazing that we have this image, and we've had members of the Bardstown community come in and actually recognize some of the older gentlemen in the photo as being relatives from their family. So that's been a great resource to have. And so what we've been working with, since we have these resources and these records documented now, we know what we have, is how are we making them available? What are we doing to work with the larger community to make these records available without, well, still sort of protecting the sisters in the community, because there's kind of a divide in the community as to what should be available and what shouldn't be available, and how much of the story should be out there and what shouldn't be. And so this is the memorial. Sister Eleanor was showing you their memorial in the cemetery. This is the memorial that the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth installed in 2012 as part of our bicentennial. It has a plaque on the front that sculptor Ed Hamilton designed. If you're from the Louisville or Kentucky area, might know that name. He did the Lincoln sculpture that's down on the Louisville waterfront. And then on the reverse side are the names of those enslaved who were buried in the cemetery at Nazareth. And so we've been working with people who are doing genealogy of their families. Because we have as much information as we do, we've tried to make that information as easily available as possible, because most of it is sort of vital statistics type of information, names, birth dates, death dates, marriages, children, that kind of information. And we've worked with reporters. We worked very closely with the New York Times reporter who did the story on, I think the title was The Nuns Who Owned Human Beings. I'm not sure if I got that exactly right, that focused on the sisters out of Virginia, but she mentioned the SCNs partly because she had read about the reconciliation service that the Lorettos and the Dominican sisters and we had been involved with, and then also the ceremony that we had in 2012 for our bicentennial. And also we had done an open house in 2017 on the sisters' relationship with the African American community that included a section on enslaved people at Nazareth. So that's how she had heard about us. And so we worked with her very closely. It was an interesting experience because we worked with our central leadership team and our communications team very closely in going through what materials she would be allowed to, what she would be allowed to see, and, you know, how much encouragement we would give her to let us sort of see what she was writing without asking for, you know, permission to edit what she was going to be doing, because obviously you don't do that. You know, journalists have their rights to write their stories, but it was a very interesting experience. And I'm happy to answer questions about that. So that's what I have on our records. So I will get out of here. And Sister Eleanor, you're on mute.
So I just wanted to congratulate you for something you threw together. It was very coherent.
Oh,
Very nice. Thank you very much.
thank you. So I was doing that pretty much without my notes and things because I just wasn't able to get anything off of our server today.
Right, right. And you're exactly right. You're way far ahead of us in identifying things. We're still finding odd little pieces all the time that are not where you would wish they would be if they were about slaveholding.
Mm.
Yeah, we are, and we understand how fortunate we are to have had this research done already, and to know what resources we have and to know who these people are.
Mhm.
Who had been enslaved, and to be able to put names and experiences with these people.
Right.
So we know that, for a lot of folks, a lot of communities, people are just at the very beginning of even knowing that enslaved people were part of their community.
Right.
So
Right. We're fortunate in one way to have a member in the 90s doing research about Loretto's slaveholding, but she was not a trained archivist nor a trained researcher. And so while she made some contributions, she was not keeping track of where she found things. And there's no record now for retrieving the sources that she was relying on for what she wrote about. So that's one reason why in our effort, as you were mentioning, to be open and to be encouraging of researchers, is that we are just at the beginning of trying to figure out how we stipulate that openness so that it works to our advantage and doesn't simply leave us with the same uncertainties that we now have.
And that's a big thing with us, is that we have the records, we're open about the fact that we have them, but using them is very much on a what's the phrase I'm looking for? Words are hard today. And a per project basis.
Discretionary or something.
Yes, it's everything is there. There's no blanket, this is open, this isn't. It's if somebody contacts us, there's very thorough reference interviews involving myself, our communications department, most likely somebody from central leadership, about what is the project, what, who is the person, what is the project. If it's a genealogy question, it's not an issue. If we have a relative or somebody contact us saying they think that one of their relatives was enslaved at Nazareth and could we help them find information, that's not, that's an easy yes, and whatever we can find on the person. Because we're fortunate that not only do we have the biographical information, but every letter that mentions an enslaved person has been indexed by, who wrote it, the date, who's mentioned in it, so you can find an individual and then have a list of every letter and every document that they are mentioned in within our records. And so it's very easy to go and pull every document that we have that relates to them. So we're fortunate in that, for especially with the genealogy reference requests. So, but when it comes to something like the New York Times report or somebody doing a dissertation, there's a lot of back and forth that goes on about what's is there related to enslaved people, but because they're records that are not normally open to the public regardless, like annals, are generally not a resource that's open for public research. If somebody has a question and we can find the records in the annals, we'll go find that answer for them, but somebody can't come in and just go in and read the annals as part of their research, unless they're a sister or they're doing, you know, say a project that the sisters have commissioned them to do. So case by case, that's the phrase I've been trying to, it's like a case by case basis. Sorry about that. So.
Thank you both so much. It was just absolutely phenomenal. Just the level of detail you went into the research, the type of records that you found, and then what came of the research and how you were able to connect with that broader community and see the community in a different light too. That's a big challenge to face. And that's why I thought even for so many of our communities that might not have had a connection with slavery, just that piece, seeing your sisters in any form of a negative light, like you said, with all the histories being so self-congratulatory, that's really what I wanted to hear more than anything, you know, that I could relate with our Sisters of Charity community. So I wanted to open up the floor to everyone if you had any questions. We still have a good 10-15 minutes if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask some questions to Kathy and Sister Eleanor.
I have a question. From the Society of the Sacred Heart, we're sort of in the middle there of having done some research, located some descendants, have an encounter, and yet ongoing research. And I wanted to ask Kathy, that was a very impressive 1912 gathering. It means that the relationship was kept on through all those years. That is probably pretty unusual. And what happened after that? Was the relationship continued?
Not as much as one would have hoped. I think as the employees who had been there kind of, I mean, a lot of them stayed there until they either passed away or retired at a very old age. If another family member didn't come on to work, a lot of that connection was lost. And as the sisters who knew the people who had worked there passed away, they did lose a lot of that connection. There's still a few folks in the Bardstown area that have a good relationship, but there's also some who the descendants that are alive now are not interested in that part of their history. They don't want to, we don't know if it's not wanting to acknowledge it or just a lack of interest, but when approached, they just don't want to be involved in a relationship with the community, and we respect that. So,
Sure.
So yeah, so it's a yes and no. I wish there had been more, but.
And Sister Eleanor, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Well, I just wanted to ask Kathy, so you said that some of those people in the picture were still living on the property. Were they sharecropping?
They would have been actual employees of the sisters. They may have been working on the farm, but not in a sharecropping situation. They would have been like a formal employee.
Let's see, we've got Virginia and then Donna Guerra. Oh. There we go. There's Virginia.
Sorry about that. Hi, Kathy, Sister Eleanor. It was a wonderful presentation. My question is, were there other communities or congregations who are going through this process and who you referenced as a template in helping you go forward with this?
When I started looking into it, I came in when Sister Teresa was already well into it, and when I was asking, especially when we were getting ready to do our open house, if there were other folks to look for advice, nobody nobody had done anything on it. Everybody wanted to know from us when we were done how things went. I wasn't able to, I'm sure there are other people out there who have done this kind of research into their communities, but I wasn't able to hook up with anybody when we were doing ours.
Thank you.
So we just, what worked for us and the materials that we had in our collection.
Right.
Thank you.
I, as a sort of a sideline to this concern about our documents, I've had an interest in identifying Black families in our neighborhood currently who want to know more about their ancestors and would want to join us in a search of their ancestors and whether they're connected to Loretto. There's one family that I know of in particular that I've been in conversation with, and in that made some contact with the Religious of the Sacred Heart, who had a big project in Louisiana, not too far from where Loretto also had a school. And their project was to identify descendants and connect them to ancestors. So I did have several conversations with them about how that went, but I haven't been able to make much use of what I've learned yet. The other is I've noticed that Scott Kiefer is on this list if he hasn't already left, and I've been prodding him with the daughters to get on with it because I think we all could learn a good deal from what the daughters have in their files and how they handle them. But maybe, Scott, can you give us an update?
Thank you.
Trust me, I'm trying to prod the daughters too. We wrote a report on some of our findings quite a while ago now at this point, and we submitted it to our leadership. And that's all I have so far. And then a long blank space.
Yeah. Do you have any explanation for the holdup, or any idea of what the reservations are besides lack of time to do anything?
Probably any answer I give there would be a guess.
Yeah.
But any guess, this is me speaking only as myself. This is me not speaking as a representative of the daughters.
Right.
I think it's a hesitancy just on lack of urgency. The problem with lack of urgency is if a reporter comes calling, or if somebody doing a research project comes calling, well, that just got urgent pretty quick, and I still don't have an answer because you never gave me one.
Right, right. That's part of my motivation too, is to be ahead of what I regard as the right of people of color and to have access to it. For the rest of you, the reason why the Daughters of Charity were a particular interest of mine is because their origins are very much like Loretto's origins. They, before Mother Seton was convinced that she wanted to be part of the Vincent de Paul kinds of stuff, she was just making up her own community as she went along. And that's very much the history of Loretto. We got away with it and she didn't, is sort of how I would say it. But the individuals were also from the old pioneer families of Maryland and the Baltimore area. And that's also the Loretto history. All of our earliest members were 6th and 7th generation Americans from the colony of Maryland. And so I keep thinking that the daughters' earliest experiences may parallel ours somewhat.
So hopefully the end will have a word to it here shortly. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Donna, would you like to speak now? Let's see if I can.
Yeah, thank you. I got it. Thanks so much for your great presentations, Kathy and Sister Eleanor. That I'm so, like, my neurons are just, you know, going crazy. I work with the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word in San Antonio, Texas. So our regionality, you know, where there was slavery in Texas, but our sisters came from France in 1869, just after, you know, the potential of people being freed. So we really didn't work with that so much. However, you know, I've noticed in our, even with Sanborn maps that show, you know, that are not mentioned so much in the annals, but, you know, the Mexican ward, the colored ward, you know, how those things played out and those relationships played out in our congregation. So I'm always trying to keep my eyes open for things like this. But for myself, in fact, just earlier this week, I sent an email. I could only find 2 instances of sisters who were missioned in and around Native American reservations. And I'm very intrigued by that. Oh, that's totally archivist driven, right? Nobody asked me to look into that, right? And so one of the things I'm wondering with your projects, if it's possible to say, or anyone else's, is are they archivist driven, or did the leadership team say, you know, we got to get going on this? You know, who's driving what, sort of? And then also I had another question for you, Kathy, about, you know, you said if they chose to be married when you were talking about the sacramental records and things like that. But wouldn't it have been the case where within that community, they would have been expected to have the sacraments rather than it being a choice? So,
Yeah,
and sometimes I think about the going down the road, as we are here, very aware in modern times, of people of color, of different sorts, who we are. You know, I'm Mexican American myself, and we look at the history of the missions, we think, well, yes, the Indians were evangelized, but weren't they forced to? And so there's a lot of reconciliation that needs to happen on all these levels. And so these are a lot of the kinds of things that I'm thinking about, even though it wasn't slavery per se, although the Native Americans were actually, but with the relationships with Mexican Americans and Native Americans and things like this. So anyway, sorry, I'm going off, but my 2 main questions were who's driving the projects, and, you know, the use of I found your use of the word choice very intriguing.
For us, the driving force behind it was initially sort of an archival interest. Both Sister Teresa Knabel was just very interested and just wanted to know more and who the people were and to have their names known, and to have the story told. And she had to get buy-in from leadership. And then once I was involved, then, you know, I was behind that, you know, 110%, as much, you know, as possible. And so also encouraging leadership to give as much support, both to the time needed to do it and also to be as open as possible with the records. So that's where that was, if the project hadn't already been started, it was definitely something that I would have tried to push for. But I think for our community anyway, it would have needed to have been done by a sister in order for there to be the buy-in that there was from the community and from leadership, at least at the beginning. And as for the choice, yeah, that's probably, I think, highly encouraged. I don't know if forced, but that's probably not far off, because if couples were going to be together and wanted to have children, it was expected that they would be married in the church so that the children would be considered legitimate, which was different than being on a non-Catholic, in a non-Catholic situation where, you know, there would be situations where any kind of relationship in that matter would not be allowed or encouraged. But, you know, Mass was offered and retreats were offered. But and this is probably more due to lack of anybody writing it down, but you didn't see where there was, it wasn't forced, but it was certainly expected, but I didn't see anything where anybody didn't go. So that's one I hadn't really, yeah, and so many, I mean, by the end, you had the majority of people who were enslaved at Nazareth had been born there. So it's kind of, the choice was, as much as a lot of us had a choice to become Catholic, which was our parents were Catholic. And so we were going to be brought up in the church regardless. So that's actually a really, that wasn't a point I had spent a lot of time considering. So thank you for bringing that up.
Right. With Loretto, we don't have any clarity right now about who the individuals were. So whether they were family units, whether they'd been around a long time, is still a mystery to us. What we do have, however, is a good deal of records about the founding priest, Charles Narings. And he was obsessed to the point of scrupulosity with the question of what are the obligations of the master for his or her enslaved person. And then derivatively, what was his obligation as the pastor of those masters? What should he require that the master have his or her slaves baptized? Should he insist that they bring them to marriage? Would he be remiss to the point of sinning if he didn't insist? And there are letters in the Vatican archives, more than one on that issue, because he was in his own conscience so unsettled on the matter. So what we have assumed here at Loretto, without a good deal of examination, was that the issue really wasn't about whether the slaves wanted to marry, because they couldn't marry without the permission of their masters. It was against the law for them to marry. And it was problematic if they married, if they didn't live in the same place. And mostly enslaved people sought partners in another place because of, in order not to be intermarrying with family. So, I think there's a lot more to be known about this. Kathy may be describing a situation that was quite unique of it that stay in the same place.
Probably. And can I share my screen real quick? I just want to show, I do have, this is from some of our resources. This is just the index to our family groups, just to give you an idea of some of the family groups that we had on the campus, if that's okay. Just real quick. Okay, let's see.
I was gonna say you should be able to hit the button. That's what I was saying. Sorry.
Yeah. Let's see. So, so these are the different families. You can see like Mary and Harry Bean had a huge family. And then Jane Wickham and Harry Bibbin. So you can get an idea of the different family units.
And
And
this
then we had
list
some
is
of the-
spanning the whole period of 45 or 50 years, right?
Correct. Yes. And then these are some of the individuals who were then employees later on at Nazareth. So.
As I'll address the other question that you had about whose idea was this. Most things in our community kind of bubble up from the ground, and if it's a bubbling process, you can bet it's going to bubble in lots of places. So I have the discretion to decide what we would spend our archival time on, and I chose to make some efforts in this direction. But as you could see from the PowerPoint, at some point I thought this is a good time to go to the elected leaders and make them aware that we have this kind of information and have a lot more. But mostly I needed to make them aware that in order for us to deepen our understanding, we really need to invite research interest and make it possible for researchers to use our material. And in order to do that, the leadership themselves are going to have to be part of deciding how open we will be. So my PowerPoint was actually a preparation for a question we'll take back to them next year. New policies about openness in the Heritage Center.
I was going to say, we'll take one more question. Ava, it looks like you have a question.
Hi. I'm with the School Sisters of St. Francis in Milwaukee. It's fascinating. And I was thinking about how, pardon my cat, thinking about how, you know, it still feels like early stages of unearthing these stories, taking accountability in this aspect of history. And I wonder, I feel like there's a later stage potentially for trying to represent a Black perspective or a marginalized perspective. So that led me to a couple of questions. One, is there any sort of, you know, artifactual evidence, realia, ephemera, anything left behind from these populations themselves who occupied these spaces, you know, within these communities? And then the follow-up to that would be, if not, has there been any thought or discussion as to how to incorporate some of that perspective into the collection? You know, without it, it still feels like a white version of this history. So I'm just thinking about, you know, to my knowledge, we don't have this aspect in the history of the community I work for, but there's a lot of work on Native American reservations and all Black schools, and I'm increasingly interested in trying to get the perspective of the recipients of those experiences for a more balanced view. So I'm interested in both of your thoughts on those issues.
Right. Congratulations. That's a really important point. We have had a little bit of experience with that. In last year, we had invited some members of the Osage Nation to visit us here in Kentucky, so we could talk about the mission that we had with them from the 1840s until the 1860s in Kansas. And they shared with us a startling piece of information that we never imagined. Was while we were happily teaching their daughters in a mission school, their tribal entity, the whole tribal community, was experiencing the separation of their children from their culture. And they mark that period of 20 years as the period in which they lost touch with their culture. While I could have guessed that, I could never have represented it the way these modern day Native Americans, the Osage, were emphatic, really, about that reality. It was really the startling kind of thing to hear.
We're struggling with how to represent those enslaved within, we have our Heritage Hall. We're trying to figure out how to represent the people who actually built the building that Heritage Hall is in. I mean, that's the physical manifestation we have on our campus are the church and our academy building, which the enslaved people helped build. We unfortunately don't have smaller, more sort of tangible objects in our collection. We do have the documentary evidence, the bills of sale, the those types of materials. We have a small committee that's actually looking into how do we create this representation on campus. We have several members of the African American community in Bardstown that we're working with, and we've been visiting some sites in Louisville that had enslaved people as part of their community, and we've been talking to them about how they tell that story, but we're struggling with it right now as to how to adequately tell that story, because we're not sure, because we don't want it to be, you know, this whitewashed story that, you know, because even some of the sisters will say, oh, well, you know, yes, people were slaves here, but, you know, if you were going to be a slave, this was a great place to, you know, be enslaved. And it's like, well, it's like, please don't say that. It's like, well, you know, yes, but they were still enslaved people. And so it's and then how, once we even figure out how to tell the story, how do we incorporate it into the exhibits that are already there? Right. You know, do you have a separate section? But then if you have a separate section, then it's sort of off by itself. How do you incorporate it so that it's part of the entire narrative? Because it is an integral part of the entire narrative. So we had just gotten started on that at the beginning of 2020. So of course it's on hold now because of COVID and not being able to do a lot of things we've been working on. But yeah, that's actually been, because we've gotten so much research done, it's what do we do with it now? How do we've had temporary things, but we want to do some sort of permanent acknowledgement other than the memorial that we have that tells more of the story, but we're not sure yet. Right. So, and we want to bring the community, the African American community, into it because it's their story. Right. And we want to make sure we're telling it in a sensitive and correct way.
Well, and I don't mean to suggest that, you know, anything you find would also be negative and controversial. I mean, there might, you know, there can be.
I mean, some of it is. It's
families, maybe they had a mix of memories, or maybe they felt conflicted as well. I don't know what you would find, but it does feel very, you know, the work to unearth these stories and account for them is such heavy lifting. It feels like that should be enough, but the reality is I think that's maybe halfway for what really needs to happen to create a complete you know, picture and understanding.
Right.
I really applaud you
And
both.
some community, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you. Some community members have told us straight out, they're like, okay, you've apologized. We don't want to hear apologies anymore. Just tell the story, include us in the story. You know, don't ignore us, and make sure our story is told, which I thought was, you know, a very powerful response.
Right.
So, but we also have others, you know, other members of the community who tell us something completely different. So it's, and when I say community, I mean in the African American community and the greater community in our area, not the sisters community. So I'm realizing I'm using words that are going to mean different things in different.
On our campus, we have half of this little log cabin here. From our original place, from the original log cabin compound, we have half of one of the log cabins at our mother house. And I feel certain that it was built by Tom, along with the priest who lived in it. But I haven't been able to convince our leadership that we should restore that log cabin. Even though I can say to them, I'm pretty sure Tom and Charles Nerinx lifted these logs themselves. So I think that raises the question then of what appeals to who, that is excellent storytelling, that conveys the feel of these problems. You know, does it, and who's going to really decide that? You know, I think I envy Kathy saying they've had committees working on these things. And I think that's going to have to be Loretto's route too, is to invite committees of people, and then to include among those committees people of color, people of various points of view, people who have kind of different kinds of ownership of the story.
Yeah, I just have to put in a brief tag for public historians out there, but it's that display aspect, that tangible representation of all of the research that you're doing. That's what people will remember. That's the major access point. That's what's going to be carried forward. So it is so vital that when it's done right. It is consulting all the different groups that are stakeholders in this topic. So thank you guys so much for staying a little bit, a lot of it actually longer than we had planned.